Don't tell Papa, the girl begged as she showed the teacher the belt marks hidden under her school dress. The morning sun painted the schoolhouse walls gold, but Sarah McKenna could see the shadows that lived in Emma Hartwell's eyes. For 3 weeks now, the 8-year-old had been different, quieter than the desert at dawn, more careful with her movements, like a bird with a broken wing trying not to show the pain. Sarah swept the chalk dust from her desk and watched Emma through the corner of her eye. The other children had rushed out into the September heat, their voices echoing off the wooden buildings of Cedar Ridge like church bells. But Emma stayed behind, her small hands folded in her lap, her blue dress faded from too many washings. "Emma," Sarah said, her voice soft as morning prayer. "The others have gone home for lunch." The girl looked up, and Sarah's heart clenched. Those eyes had seen too much for someone so young. They held the kind of silence that comes after screaming, when the throat is raw and the tears have dried to salt. "Yes, Miss McKenna," Emma whispered. Sarah knelt beside the wooden desk where Emma sat. The schoolroom smelled of chalk and children's sweat, mixed with the sage that grew wild outside the windows. Through the glass, she could see the main street of Cedar Ridge stretching toward the horizon like a dusty promise. "You've been hurting," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Emma's fingers twisted in the fabric of her dress. The cotton was soft from wear, patched in 2 places with pieces that didn't quite match. Sarah had noticed how the girl winced when she sat down, how she favored her left side when she walked. "I'm fine, Miss McKenna," Emma said, but her voice broke on the words like dry wood splitting. Sarah had been teaching for 2 years, ever since she'd come west from Missouri after her father died. She'd learned to read the signs that children carried, the hunger that showed in hollow cheeks, the fear that lived behind quick glances toward the door, the shame that made them small and quiet. But this was different. This was pain wrapped in silence and tied with secrets. "Emma," Sarah said again, reaching out to touch the girl's hand. "Sometimes when we hurt, it helps to tell someone." The child pulled her hand away, tucking it against her chest like protecting something precious. Outside, a horse snorted and stamped in the heat. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The normal sounds of a frontier town going about its business, while a little girl carried the weight of the world in her 8-year-old heart. "Papa says I mustn't tell stories," Emma whispered. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd met Thomas Hartwell several times since school started. He was a big man with hands like leather and a voice that carried across a room. He owned the largest ranch outside town and sat on the church council. People respected him. People listened when he spoke. This wouldn't be his story, would it, Emma? Sarah asked. The girl's eyes filled with tears that she wouldn't let fall. She shook her head, just barely, like even that small movement might give too much away. Sarah stood and walked to the window. Cedar Ridge spread out before her like a painting done in brown and gold. The general store, the saloon, the church with its white steeple pointing toward heaven. It looked peaceful. It looked like the kind of place where children should be safe. But she'd learned that looks could lie. "Emma," she said, not turning around. "Would you like some water? You look tired." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah went to the water bucket in the corner and filled a tin cup. When she turned back, Emma was standing, but something was wrong with the way she moved. She held herself too straight, too careful, like someone trying not to disturb a wound. Sarah set the cup on the desk and sat down across from the girl. "Emma, I need you to know something. This schoolhouse is a safe place. Nothing you tell me here will get you in trouble. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, but her eyes said she didn't believe it. How could she? When you're 8 years old and the person who's supposed to protect you is the one causing the pain, who can you trust? "Will you show me where it hurts?" Sarah asked. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the windows. Emma stared at her teacher with eyes that seemed older than her years. Then, slowly, she reached for the buttons on the back of her dress. "Don't tell Papa," she whispered, so quiet Sarah almost missed it. "Please don't tell Papa." Sarah's hands trembled as she helped Emma with the buttons. The dress fell away like a curtain, revealing the truth that had been hidden underneath. Red welts crossed the girl's back in straight lines. Some were fresh, dark, and angry. Others had faded to purple and yellow, the colors of old pain. Sarah had to close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Emma was watching her with the desperate hope of someone drowning who'd just seen a rope thrown into the water. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah breathed. "He gets angry," Emma said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way children have when they're explaining something they think is normal. "When I spill things or talk too loud or forget to do my chores. He says I need to learn." Sarah's throat felt tight. She wanted to scream. She wanted to ride out to the Hartwell Ranch and confront Thomas Hartwell with his crimes. But Emma was looking at her with such fragile trust, and she knew that whatever she did next would either save this child or break her completely. "Emma," she said carefully, "this isn't your fault. You know that, don't you?" The girl shook her head. "I should be better. I should remember not to make him mad." "No, honey, no." Sarah reached out and gently helped Emma pull her dress back up. "What's happening to you isn't right. It's not your fault, and it's not something you should have to carry alone." Emma's eyes went wide with fear. "You can't tell anyone. He said if I told, he'd send me away. He said no one would believe me anyway, because I'm just a child and he's important." Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She'd heard those words before from other children in other places. The threats that kept victims silent. The lies that made them think they deserved the pain. "Emma," she said, kneeling down so they were eye to eye, "I believe you, and I'm going to help you. But you promised you wouldn't tell Papa." Sarah took a deep breath. The afternoon sun was starting to slant through the windows, painting everything in golden light. Soon, parents would start coming to collect their children. Soon, Thomas Hartwell might come looking for his daughter. She thought about her promise, about the trust in Emma's eyes, about the marks on the girl's back and the fear in her voice when she begged her teacher to keep her secret. Some promises, Sarah realized, were made to be broken. But looking at Emma's face, seeing the desperate hope there mixed with terror, she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move could make everything worse for this child who had already suffered too much. "I won't tell your papa," Sarah said finally. "But Emma, there are other people who can help. People whose job it is to keep children safe." The fear in Emma's eyes deepened, and Sarah felt the weight of the choice she was about to make settle on her shoulders like a heavy coat. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the schoolhouse walls and stirring the dust in the street. Tomorrow, she would have to decide what kind of teacher she wanted to be. What kind of woman? What kind of person who had seen the truth and couldn't pretend it didn't exist? But tonight, Emma Hartwell would go home to her father's house, carrying her secrets and her pain, while her teacher lay awake wondering if silence was just another word for cowardice. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small room above the general store, listening to the wind move through Cedar Ridge like a restless spirit. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma's back, the straight lines of pain, the way the girl had whispered her plea like a prayer to a God who might not be listening. When morning came, it brought Thomas Hartwell with it. Sarah was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when she saw him riding down Main Street. He sat tall in his saddle, hat pulled low against the sun, looking like every picture of a successful rancher she'd ever seen. His horse was well-fed and groomed. His clothes were clean. His boots had been polished to a shine that caught the morning light. He looked like a good man. Sarah's hands tightened on the broom handle as he dismounted in front of the schoolhouse. She'd met him before, of course, at church socials and town meetings. He had a firm handshake and a ready smile. He donated money to the school fund and always tipped his hat to ladies on the street. "Morning, Miss McKenna," he said, removing his hat as he approached. His voice was warm, friendly, the voice of a man who had nothing to hide. "Mr. Hartwell," Sarah replied, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I wanted to thank you for keeping Emma after school yesterday. She said you helped her with her arithmetic." He smiled, and Sarah could see how people would trust him, how they would never think to look beyond the surface. "She's a bright girl," Sarah said carefully. "That she is. Takes after her mother, God rest her soul." Thomas's face grew somber for a moment, and Sarah saw what looked like genuine grief there. "Emma's all I have left of Martha. Sometimes I worry I'm not raising her right, being on my own." The words hit Sarah like a slap. Here was a man who beat his daughter, standing in front of her school, talking about worry and loss and doing right by his child. The contradiction made her stomach turn. "I'm sure you're doing your best," she managed to say. "Well, I try." Emma can be difficult sometimes, strong-willed like her mother was. But I reckon that's not a bad thing in a woman, as long as it's guided proper. He settled his hat back on his head. "I best let you get to your teaching." "Thank you again, Miss McKenna." Sarah watched him ride away, dust rising from his horse's hooves like smoke. She stood there until he disappeared around the corner, her hands shaking with anger and something that felt like despair. The children began arriving soon after. Emma came with the Carlson boy, walking slowly beside his horse while he rode. Sarah noticed how the girl kept her distance from the other children, how she moved like someone who hurt in places that didn't show. "Good morning, Emma," Sarah said as the girl climbed the schoolhouse steps. "Morning, Miss McKenna." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah wanted to kneel down and hold the child, wanted to tell her that everything would be all right. But she couldn't make that promise. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The morning lessons passed in a blur. Sarah taught arithmetic and reading while part of her mind stayed focused on Emma. The girl sat perfectly still at her desk, her hands folded, her attention fixed on her slate. She never raised her hand, never spoke unless directly asked a question. At lunchtime, while the other children ran outside to play, Emma lingered again. Sarah had come to expect it. The schoolhouse had become the girl's sanctuary, the one place where she didn't have to pretend everything was fine. "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked, taking a piece of bread from her lunch basket. Emma shook her head, but Sarah saw the way her eyes lingered on the food. She cut the bread in half and placed a piece on Emma's desk anyway. "Sometimes I pack too much," she said gently. Emma ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned not to take anything for granted. Sarah watched her and felt something break inside her chest. This child should be laughing with her friends, should be complaining about her lessons or daydreaming about growing up. Instead, she sat in the empty schoolhouse, grateful for a piece of bread and a moment of kindness. "Miss McKenna," Emma said suddenly, "do you ever wish you could fly away? Like the birds?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She looked at Emma's serious little face and saw the longing there, the desperate need to escape to somewhere safe. "Sometimes," Sarah said honestly, "but then I think about the people who would miss me if I flew away. The children I teach, the friends I've made." "Oh," Emma's voice was small. "I don't think anyone would miss me." "That's not true, Emma. I would miss you. Very much." The girl looked up with surprise, as if the idea that someone might care about her had never occurred to her before. It was a look that made Sarah want to cry. After school, Sarah walked through town with different eyes. She saw Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry behind the boarding house, close enough to the Hartwell place to hear if a child cried out in the night. She saw Sheriff Morrison tipping his hat to Thomas Hartwell outside the bank, two respected men sharing a joke about something. She saw Dr. Matthews loading his bag into his buggy and wondered if he'd ever been called to tend to mysterious injuries on a little girl. If he'd ever asked questions he didn't want answered. At the general store, Mrs. Carlson was buying flour and coffee. Sarah had known her since arriving in Cedar Ridge. She was a kind woman, a mother herself. "How are your students this year, dear?" Mrs. Carlson asked. "They're wonderful," Sarah replied. Then, carefully, she added, "though I worry about some of them." Little Emma Hartwell seemed so quiet. Mrs. Carlson's face grew still for just a moment. Something flickered in her eyes before she looked away. "Well, that child has had a hard time since her mother passed. Thomas does his best, but raising a girl alone, it's not easy for a man." "No," Sarah said. "I suppose not." But she heard what Mrs. Carlson didn't say, saw the way the woman's hands tightened on her packages, heard the careful tone that people used when they were talking around a truth they didn't want to face. That evening, Sarah sat at her small table with paper and pen in front of her. She'd started 3 different letters. One to the territorial judge in the county seat, one to the church board, one to her cousin in Denver who might know what to do. But each time she began to write, she heard Emma's voice, "Don't tell Papa." She thought about the trust in the girl's eyes, about promises made and broken, about the difference between helping someone and betraying them. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky the color of old blood. Somewhere in this town, A little girl was probably helping her father with evening chores, being careful not to move too fast or speak too loud, being careful not to give him a reason to reach for his belt. Sarah folded the letters and put them in her drawer. She would try something else first, something that wouldn't break her promise to Emma, but might still find a way to help. She would watch. She would wait. She would be ready. Because sometimes the difference between saving someone and failing them came down to timing. And Sarah McKenna was learning that in a town where good men looked away, it might take a woman to finally see clearly. The question was whether she would have the courage to act when a moment came, or she would become just another person who chose silence over a child's pain. The morning Emma came to school with blood on her collar, Sarah knew her time of waiting was over. It was a Thursday in late September, the kind of day when the desert heat still pressed down on Cedar Ridge like a heavy hand, but the nights had started to whisper of winter coming. Sarah was writing the day's lessons on the blackboard when she heard footsteps on the schoolhouse porch, slower than usual, careful and measured. Emma appeared in the doorway like a ghost of herself. Her dress was clean, but Sarah could see the dark stain at the collar, where someone had tried to wash away what looked like dry blood. The girl's left eye was swollen, not quite closed, but heading that way, and she held her right arm close to her body. Sarah dropped the chalk. It hit the wooden floor with a sharp crack that made Emma flinch. "Emma," Sarah breathed. "I'm sorry I'm late." "Miss McKenna," the girl whispered, making her way to her desk with the careful movements of someone who hurt everywhere. "I had extra chores this morning." The other children began filtering in, their voices loud and cheerful in the morning air. But they grew quiet when they saw Emma, the way children do when they sense something wrong but don't have words for it. Johnny Carlson stared openly at Emma's swollen eye until his sister elbowed him and hissed at him to mind his manners. Sarah tried to teach. She called out spelling words and listened to the children recite their times tables. But her eyes kept drifting to Emma's desk, to the careful way the girl held her pencil, to the wince that crossed her face every time she had to move her arm. When lunchtime came and the other children scattered outside, Sarah closed the schoolhouse door and turned to face Emma. The girl sat perfectly still, her good eye fixed on her hands. "Emma," Sarah said, kneeling beside the desk. "What happened to you?" "I fell," Emma said quickly. Too quickly. "Off the porch steps. Papa says I need to be more careful." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd heard those words before from other children in other places. The practiced lies that came so easily when the truth was too dangerous to tell. "Emma, honey, look at me." The girl raised her head, and Sarah saw the fear there. Not just fear of her father, but fear of what might happen if the truth came out. Fear that things might get worse instead of better. "I need to take care of these injuries," Sarah said gently. "And then I need to ask you some questions. Can you trust me to do what's right?" Emma's good eye filled with tears. "You promised you wouldn't tell Papa." "I know what I promised. But Emma, this has gone too far. Someone needs to protect you." "He'll send me away," Emma whispered. "He said he would. He said no one wants a troublemaker child. And if I can't learn to behave, he'll find someone who can teach me better." Sarah felt her heart break a little more. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a clean cloth and the small bottle of carbolic acid she kept for cleaning cuts and scrapes. As she gently cleaned the blood from Emma's neck, she made her decision. "Emma," she said softly, "I want you to stay here this afternoon, inside the schoolhouse. Can you do that for me?" The girl nodded, though Sarah could see the fear growing in her eyes. "I'm going to have a talk with your father. Not to get you in trouble, but to make sure you're safe. Do you understand?" "He won't listen," Emma said. "He says teachers don't know anything about raising children. He says I need a firm hand because I'm wild like my mother was." Sarah finished cleaning Emma's wounds and helped her drink some water from the tin cup. Then she walked to the window and looked out at Cedar Ridge, at the dusty street and the buildings that baked in the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, Thomas Hartwell was going about his business, playing the part of the respected rancher while his daughter sat in a schoolhouse with a black eye and blood on her dress. The confrontation came sooner than Sarah expected. She was sitting with Emma, helping her practice her letters with her left hand since her right arm was too sore to move properly, when heavy footsteps sounded on the porch. The door opened without a knock, and Thomas Hartwell filled the doorway like a storm cloud. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. "Time to come home." Emma shrank in her seat, and Sarah felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Actually, Mr. Hartwell," Sarah said, standing up, "I'd like to speak with you first." Thomas stepped into the schoolhouse, his eyes taking in the scene. Emma cowering at her desk, Sarah standing between them like a shield. His face hardened. "Emma, get your things. Now." "Mr. Hartwell," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat. "We need to talk about what's been happening to your daughter." "What's been happening," Thomas said slowly, "is that my child has been telling lies to her teacher." "Emma, come here." The girl looked between her father and her teacher with desperate eyes. Sarah could see her trembling. "She's not lying," Sarah said. "I've seen the marks, Mr. Hartwell. I've seen what you've done to her." The silence that followed was like the moment before lightning strikes. Thomas Hartwell's face went very still, and Sarah saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. "You're mistaken, Miss McKenna," he said, his voice quiet now, which somehow made it more frightening. "My daughter is clumsy. She falls down a lot. Don't you, Emma?" Emma made a small sound that might have been agreement, but Sarah could see the tears starting to fall down her cheeks. "This isn't from falling," Sarah said, gesturing toward Emma's injuries. "This is from violence. And I won't stand by and let it continue." Thomas took a step closer, and Sarah had to fight the urge to back away. He was a big man, and she was suddenly very aware of how isolated the schoolhouse was, how far they were from help. "You're new here, Miss McKenna," Thomas said. "You don't understand how things work in Cedar Ridge. People mind their own business. They don't go around making accusations they can't prove." "I can prove it," Sarah said. "I've seen the belt marks on her back. I've documented her injuries. And I'm prepared to take this to the territorial authorities if necessary." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. The mask of respectability slipped, and Sarah saw the man underneath. The one who could hurt a child and feel justified doing it. "Emma," he said, never taking his eyes off Sarah, "go wait by the horse." "Don't," Sarah said quickly. "Emma, you don't have to go with him. You can stay here." The girl looked between them with terror in her eyes. She was 8 years old, caught between the two most important adults in her small world, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she might have just made things infinitely worse for her. "You're making a mistake," Thomas said to Sarah, his voice low and dangerous. "A big mistake. This town respects me. They trust me. And you're just a spinster schoolteacher from back east who doesn't know her place." "My place," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice, "is protecting the children in my care." Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see about that." He turned toward Emma, who was pressed back against her desk like a cornered animal. "Come along, daughter. Time to go home." The word home sounded like a threat. Emma stood on shaking legs and walked toward her father, her head down, her spirit broken. At the doorway, she turned back to look at Sarah with eyes that held both gratitude and accusation. "Thank you for trying," they seemed to say, "and I'm sorry for what's going to happen now." After they left, Sarah sank into her chair and put her head in her hands. Outside, she could hear voices gathering in the street. Word traveled fast in a small town, and soon everyone would know that the schoolteacher had accused Thomas Hartwell of beating his child. She thought about Emma going home with him now, about what might happen behind the closed doors of the Hartwell ranch. She thought about the promise she'd broken and the trust she might have destroyed. But she also thought about the blood on Emma's collar and the fear in her eyes, and she knew that some promises were worth breaking if it meant a child might finally be safe. The sun was setting over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky the color of old wounds, and Sarah McKenna sat alone in her schoolhouse, wondering if doing the right thing would be enough to save one small girl from the darkness that waited at home. Emma didn't come to school the next day, or the day after that. Sarah stood at the schoolhouse window each morning, watching the dusty road that led from town toward the Hartwell ranch, hoping to see a small figure walking toward her. But the road stayed empty except for the usual traffic of wagons and riders going about their business. The other children asked where Emma was. Sarah told them the girl was sick, which felt true enough. Sick with fear. Sick with pain. Sick with the weight of secrets that no child should have to carry. By the third day, word had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. The schoolteacher had accused Thomas Hartwell of beating his daughter. People took sides the way they always did in small towns, with hushed conversations in the general store and careful glances across the church pews on Sunday. Some believed Sarah, mostly the women, who had seen things they hadn't talked about but remembered in the quiet corners of their hearts. Others defended Thomas, saying he was a good man who'd lost his wife and was doing his best to raise a difficult child alone. Sheriff Morrison came to see Sarah on Friday afternoon. He was a decent man, but he moved like someone carrying a burden he didn't want to bear. "Miss McKenna," he said, settling his hat in his hands as he stood in the schoolhouse doorway. "I need to ask you some questions." Sarah invited him in, her heart beating fast. She'd been expecting this visit, dreading it and hoping for it at the same time. "Tom Hartwell says you've been filling his daughter's head with ideas. Says you're trying to turn the child against him." The sheriff's voice was careful, neutral. "He's asking me to look into whether you're fit to be teaching our children." "And what do you think, Sheriff?" Sarah asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, looking around the schoolhouse at the children's drawings on the walls, the neat rows of desks, the books Sarah had brought from Missouri at her own expense. "I think," he said finally, "that you're a good teacher who cares about her students. But I also think you might be getting yourself into something that's bigger than you understand." "What I understand," Sarah said, "is that a child was being hurt, and no one was doing anything to stop it. You got proof of that? Besides what a scared little girl might have told you." Sarah thought about Emma's back, about the careful way she moved, about the blood on her collar. But she also thought about how such things might sound in a courtroom, how easily they could be explained away by a man with Thomas Hartwell's reputation. "I have what I've seen," she said. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Well, I got to investigate any complaint that gets made. But Miss McKenna, I'm going to give you some advice, whether you want it or not. Tom Hartwell's got friends in this town. Important friends. If you're wrong about this, it could go very badly for you. And if I'm right..." Morrison's face grew sad. "Then God help us all for the things we've chosen not to see." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the schoolhouse as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. She thought about packing her things and leaving Cedar Ridge, about finding another town where she could teach children and help them learn to read and write without having to worry about the darkness that lived behind closed doors. But then she thought about Emma, and she knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah was reading her Bible and drinking coffee in her small room when Mrs. Carlson knocked on her door. The older woman's face was drawn with worry, but there was something else there too, something that looked like determination. "Miss McKenna," she said, "I wonder if we might talk." They sat at Sarah's small table, and Mrs. Carlson twisted her hands at her lap before she spoke. "My Johnny came home asking questions," she said, "about why Emma hasn't been in school, about what it means when grown-ups hurt children." She looked up at Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I should have spoken up before. We all should have." "What do you mean?" "We heard things. At night, when the wind was quiet. Sounds carrying from the Hartwell place. A child crying. A man shouting. Mrs. Carlson's voice broke. We told ourselves it wasn't our business. That Tom was grieving his wife and trying to manage alone. But deep down we knew." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, exactly, but the knowledge that she hadn't been walking this path completely alone. "There are others," Mrs. Carlson continued. "Other women who've been thinking the same thoughts, having the same fears. We want to help, Miss McKenna. We want to do what's right." That afternoon, 5 women came to the schoolhouse. Mrs. Carlson, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, Dr. Matthews' wife, the pastor's wife, and old Mrs. Granger who ran the bakery. They sat in the children's desks, looking both determined and frightened. "We've been talking," Mrs. Henderson said, "about Emma, about what you saw, about what we should have seen. Tom Hartwell may have friends," added Mrs. Matthews, "but so do we. And sometimes it takes women to protect the children when the men are too busy protecting each other." They made a plan. Not a loud one, Not a dramatic confrontation that would give Thomas more reasons to hurt his daughter, but a quiet revolution of care and watchfulness. They would take turns bringing food to the Hartwell Ranch, always with an excuse, always with eyes open. They would make sure Emma wasn't forgotten, wasn't invisible. And if we see proof, Mrs. Granger said, her voice firm despite her 70 years, we'll act on it. Together. The change came slowly, like sunrise over the desert. Emma returned to school the following Monday, walking beside Mrs. Carlson's wagon instead of coming alone. Her eye had healed, but she was quieter than ever. She sat at her desk and did her lessons without speaking, like a bird that had forgotten how to sing. But Sarah noticed other things too. How Mrs. Henderson seemed to find reasons to visit the Hartwell Ranch every few days. How Dr. Matthews started riding that way on his rounds, just checking on folks. How the pastor began including pointed sermons about protecting the innocent and the responsibility of community. Most importantly, Sarah noticed how Emma began to straighten her shoulders when she saw the women watching over her. How she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The real breakthrough came on a Thursday in October. Emma stayed after school again, but this time she didn't sit in frightened silence. Instead, she walked to Sarah's desk and placed a piece of paper there. It was a letter written in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. Dear Miss McKenna, thank you for not giving up on me. I know you kept your promise because you never told Papa what I showed you. But you told the right people. I'm still scared sometimes, but I'm not scared all the time anymore. The ladies who come to visit make me feel safer. Papa is different when they're around. He smiles more and his voice isn't so angry. I think maybe he's remembering how to be good again. I wanted you to know that even when things hurt, having someone believe you makes it better. Your student, Emma. Sarah read the letter twice, tears blurring her vision. When she looked up, Emma was watching her with something new in her eyes. Not just trust, but hope. You found your voice, Sarah said softly. Emma nodded. You helped me remember I had one. Outside the schoolhouse windows, the sun was setting over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. The town looked the same as it always had, but Sarah knew something fundamental had changed. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to matter. Sometimes healing didn't come from grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Sometimes it came from women sitting in children's desks, making quiet plans to protect what needed protecting. From a community learning to see what it had chosen to ignore. From a child finding the courage to believe that her voice mattered, that her pain wasn't something she had to carry alone. As Emma walked home that evening, no longer hurrying, no longer afraid to be seen, Sarah understood that some battles were won not with noise and fury, but with patience and love and the stubborn refusal to look away from hard truths. The desert wind moved through Cedar Ridge like a whisper of change, carrying with it the promise that broken things could heal, that silence could be broken, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could light candles in the darkest places, showing the way home for lost and frightened souls.